The whisper of the grand piano's final note hung in the air like an unspoken confession, reverberating through the opulent drawing-room of Sir Reginald Cavanagh's country estate. Outside, the wind howled against the mullioned windows, and the flicker of the chandeliers cast a restless dance of shadows on the walls. The gathered guests, still in the throes of applause, were blissfully unaware that tragedy had already struck within those very walls. The occasion was meant to be a celebration, a soirée of music, laughter, and perhaps a touch of scandal, hosted by the illustrious Sir Reginald, an aging philanthropist known for his lavish tastes and impeccable social circle. But the performance, though flawless in technique, was marred by the sour undertone of disquiet. At the grand piano sat Lucien Bellamy, the celebrated virtuoso, his fingers still poised over the keys as if uncertain whether to play on or fall into silence. His pale face betrayed an unease that did not escape the observant eyes of the audience. From the corner of the room, Lady Helena Cavanagh, Reginald's much younger and rather striking second wife, observed her husband's stiff form with a wary eye. Sir Reginald himself seemed oblivious to her presence, more focused on his guest of honor, the enigmatic and soft-spoken Dr. Anton Beaulieu, a renowned psychiatrist from Paris. It was during this odd moment of tension, just as the applause waned and conversations resumed, that a scream cut through the evening's elegance like a knife. "Help! Someone, please!" cried Daphne Merriweather, the governess, her face ashen as she stumbled into the room, clutching the doorframe. "It's Sir Reginald. He's dead." The ripple of shock was instantaneous. Glasses were dropped, murmurs swelled, and Lucien's hands fell from the keys, hanging limp at his sides. Dr. Beaulieu, more composed than most, rushed to Daphne's side, while Lady Helena, for a fleeting moment, seemed more relieved than horrified. The guests crowded the doorway, peering into the adjoining study where Sir Reginald lay sprawled on the floor beside his writing desk, his face frozen in a ghastly grimace. Dr. Beaulieu bent down, pressing 2 fingers to the old man's neck, and gave a grim nod. "He is gone," the doctor declared somberly. But as the stunned guests whispered among themselves, one voice broke through the confusion, a measured, melodic tone that seemed almost out of place amid the chaos. "Mon Dieu," it intoned softly, "what a peculiar setting for a death, surrounded by the beauty of music and the discord of fate." Hercule Poirot, who had been quietly observing from the far end of the room, rose from his seat. With his immaculate attire and perfectly waxed mustache, he looked every inch the peculiar yet dignified detective. He adjusted his cuffs and moved forward with a precision that spoke of purpose. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot addressed them gently, his gaze sharp and unyielding, "I suggest we take a step back. We must preserve the scene, n'est-ce pas? Already there are too many footprints, too many impressions on this fragile tapestry of evidence." A hush fell as the gravity of Poirot's words settled. One guest, Major Fitzroy, a retired officer with a booming voice, protested surely it was his heart. Reginald was not a young man. Poirot's grey eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Perhaps," he allowed, "but if it is only the heart, why then do I smell the faint trace of bitter almonds in the air?" A collective gasp arose. Bitter almonds, the unmistakable odor of cyanide. With the room now gripped by fear and suspicion, Poirot surveyed the scene once more, his mind already tracing the intricate lines of human behavior that so often led to the truth. He glanced at the pianist, Lucien Bellamy, whose hands still trembled slightly, and then at Lady Helena, whose earlier look of relief had transformed into a mask of solemnity. Poirot's mind whirred. A man was dead, poisoned amid the sounds of a haunting melody. There were many questions to be asked, many faces to study. Most importantly, there was the question of why, a question that always led inexorably to the heart of the matter. The guests drew back as Poirot approached the study door, his small polished shoes tapping lightly on the polished oak floor. He moved with the calm precision of a chess master taking his first calculated move. The air around the study felt heavier, as if the very atmosphere had absorbed the finality of Sir Reginald's death. Poirot paused at the threshold, his sharp eyes sweeping over the scene before stepping inside, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of evidence. Sir Reginald's body lay on its side, his right hand clutching the edge of his mahogany desk. His head turned slightly as if he had twisted at the last moment, surprised by death's sudden grip. His eyes, still open, stared blankly at the Persian rug beneath him, its rich colors marred by the ivory pallor of his face. An overturned crystal glass, a half-written letter, and a small ornate silver box with a hinged lid stood on the desk beside an unlit cigar. Dr. Beaulieu, still kneeling beside the body, glanced up at Poirot. "It appears swift," he murmured. "No sign of struggle. Likely cyanide, as you suggested, Monsieur Poirot." The scent was unmistakable. "Merci, doctor," Poirot replied, his eyes lingering on the fallen man's outstretched hand. "But let us not assume too quickly. Even the most obvious conclusions can sometimes mislead." Lady Helena had followed, her slender figure framed by the doorway, one gloved hand resting lightly on the frame as if to steady herself. She watched Poirot intently, her dark eyes wary, lips pressed together in a thin line. Poirot caught her gaze and offered a small, polite nod before turning his attention back to the body. "Madame," Poirot said gently, "if you would be so kind, please gather the guests in the drawing room. I should like to speak with each of them presently." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded, her auburn curls swaying slightly as she turned on her heel and swept back into the larger room. Poirot heard her clear, commanding voice instructing the other guests, a hint of steel underlying the tremor in her words. Poirot took a slow step around the body, examining the room with the keen eye of a collector appraising a rare piece of art. His gaze fell upon the half-written letter on the desk. It was written in Sir Reginald's distinctive, bold hand, the ink still fresh. "My dear friend, I must speak with you most urgently. There are matters which—" It ended abruptly, the line trailing off as if cut short by the writer's final breath. Poirot's fingers hovered over the paper for a moment before he noticed a faint smudge of ink near the bottom, a small, almost imperceptible print left by the edge of a finger or the corner of a cuff. He made a mental note, careful not to touch the paper, before turning his attention to the small silver box. He flipped open the lid with a gloved finger, revealing a neat row of thin, pale pills. A closer inspection confirmed his suspicion. Amyl nitrite, often used to relieve the sudden chest pains of angina, a condition known to plague Sir Reginald in recent years. Yet the presence of these pills suggested the old man had been prepared for a possible attack, making the sudden collapse more puzzling. Poirot straightened, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the scene once more. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned chair or disarrayed papers. The air, despite the lingering note of bitter almonds, carried no scent of burning tobacco, indicating that Sir Reginald had not had the chance to light his cigar before death claimed him. He stepped back into the hallway, where Daphne Merriweather still clutched the door frame, her wide, frightened eyes following his every move. Poirot regarded her for a moment, noting the slight tremble in her hands, the shallow rise and fall of her chest. "Miss Merriweather," he said softly, his voice a steadying force in the rising tide of panic. "You were the first to discover Sir Reginald. Tell me, how did you come to find him?" Daphne swallowed hard, her voice catching in her throat. I had just finished tending to the children in the nursery. I came downstairs to fetch a book for Lady Helena. She had asked for one of the novels Sir Reginald kept in his study. When I opened the door, I saw him there, on the floor. I didn't know what to do." Poirot nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Did you touch anything? The desk, perhaps, or the glass on the floor?" "No, Monsieur Poirot. I was too Too frightened." Poirot's eyes softened for a moment, and he offered a small, reassuring smile. "Bon. You did well, mademoiselle. Not to disturb the scene. Please join the others in the drawing room. I will speak with you again shortly." As Daphne moved away, Poirot turned his attention to the hallway itself. The plush carpet showed no obvious signs of disturbance, but a faint, irregular pattern of dust near the doorframe caught his eye. He bent down, peering closely at the barely perceptible trail. Someone had hesitated here, perhaps, before entering or exiting the study. A small clue, but a clue nonetheless. Poirot straightened, adjusting the cuffs of his perfectly tailored suit as he turned back to the study for one last sweep. He noted the placement of the furniture, the undisturbed state of the papers on the desk, and the still fresh ink on the letter. He was building a picture in his mind, a careful, methodical reconstruction of the final moments of Sir Reginald's life. As he stepped back into the hallway, Poirot allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The pieces were beginning to form a shape, the first hints of a pattern emerging from the chaos. There were questions yet to be answered, but already his little grey cells were stirring, drawn by the tantalizing scent of mystery and deceit. As Poirot entered the drawing room, he found the assembled guests a picture of brittle calm, each one carefully arranging their expressions to conceal a swirl of private thoughts. The room, once filled with the graceful strains of Lucien Bellome's performance, now held only the nervous rustle of fabric and the low murmur of strained conversation. Lady Helena had taken a seat by the marble fireplace, her back straight, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. Major Fitzroy paced by the bay window, his jaw set and his eyes fixed on the storm-lashed garden beyond. Lucien Bellamy had retreated to the far corner, his dark eyes cast downward as if the polished floor held answers to unspoken questions. Poirot moved to the center of the room, clasping his hands together as he regarded the group with a small, knowing smile. He began with a gentle clearing of his throat, drawing their attention without the need for raised voices or dramatic gestures. "Mes amis," he began, his voice calm yet commanding, "I must ask for your patience. A great tragedy has occurred in our midst. Sir Reginald is dead, and while it is possible that his passing was natural, certain details compel me to investigate further." Lady Helena's eyes flicked up, a hint of defiance flickering beneath the veneer of grief. Major Fitzroy ceased his pacing, his brow furrowing deeply, while Daphne Merriweather, seated on the edge of a nearby settee, clutched her lace handkerchief so tightly that her knuckles gleamed white. "To begin," Poirot continued, his gaze moving slowly from face to face, "I must ask each of you a few simple questions. Please do not be alarmed. It is merely the first step in untangling this unfortunate matter." He turned to Lucien Bellamy, whose head remained bowed, his fingers tapping an irregular rhythm against his trouser leg, a musician's nervous habit. "Monsieur Bellamy," Poirot said gently, "if you would be so kind as to speak with me first." Bellamy's head snapped up, his dark curls falling into his eyes, which now seemed wide and glassy in the dim light. He hesitated, then rose slowly, crossing the room with the graceful, fluid movement of a performer accustomed to the spotlight, despite the pallor that clung to his features. Poirot gestured toward a small, wing-backed chair near the hearth, and Bellamy sank into it with a sigh, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Poirot took a seat opposite him, leaning forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Bellamy's face. "Monsieur," he began, his tone light yet penetrating, "you were playing when Sir Reginald collapsed. Tell me, did you notice anything unusual before the unfortunate discovery?" Bellamy's throat worked as he swallowed, his gaze darting briefly to Lady Helena before returning to Poirot. I'm not sure what you mean, Monsieur Poirot. The music, it has a way of drawing one into a trance, yes? I did not see anything, I only heard the scream." Poirot's head tilted slightly, his moustache twitching as he considered the man's words. "And yet you hesitated," he observed, his voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing Bellamy to lean in slightly. When the scream echoed through the room, you froze. Your hands fell from the keys, and for a moment you looked not merely shocked, but guilty. Bellamy flinched, his eyes widening further. "No, you misunderstand, Monsieur Poirot. I was merely startled. Yes, startled. It is not every evening that such a thing occurs." Poirot allowed a small, almost fatherly smile to cross his lips, his eyes never leaving Bellamy's face. Of course. But tell me, Monsieur Bellamy, how well did you know Sir Reginald?" The pianist hesitated, his gaze flicking once more to Lady Helena, who remained as still as a statue, her dark eyes unblinking. Bellamy's jaw tightened and his fingers twisted together like the intertwined notes of a complex sonata. "We were acquaintances," he replied slowly, his voice dropping to a near murmur. "I performed at several of his gatherings, as you know, and he was generous with his patronage. But beyond that, I cannot say we were close." Poirot's smile faded, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "And yet you seem troubled, as if there were something unsaid between you." Bellamy's face turned a shade paler, and he glanced nervously around the room, his gaze settling once more on Lady Helena. She, for her part, remained impassive, her gloved hands still folded tightly in her lap. Poirot's sharp eyes missed nothing. "Very well, Monsieur Bellamy," Poirot said, leaning back and adjusting his cuffs with a precise, measured movement. "I shall not press you further for now. But remember, the truth has a way of surfacing, even when buried beneath the most carefully composed façade." Bellamy gave a short, tight nod and rose, returning to his corner with a stiffness that betrayed his tension. Poirot's gaze followed him for a moment before turning to Lady Helena, who now met his eyes with a defiant, almost challenging expression. "Madame," Poirot said softly, his tone shifting to one of cautious respect, "perhaps you would be so kind as to speak with me next." Lady Helena did not rise, but instead straightened her back, her chin lifting slightly. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot," she replied, her voice cool and composed, though a flicker of something, fear perhaps or resentment, passed through her eyes. "I have nothing to hide." Poirot smiled, a small, knowing smile that lingered a fraction too long. "Ah, but we all have secrets, madame," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "It is only a question of how deeply they are buried." As he rose to follow her to a quieter corner of the room, Poirot's mind raced, piecing together the subtle threads of tension that now bound these guests together. A half-finished letter, a musician's trembling hands, a young wife's guarded glances, each a note in the unfolding symphony of suspicion and deceit. Poirot settled himself beside Lady Helena, choosing a chair that placed him slightly below her eye level, a subtle gesture designed to ease her defenses. She remained composed, her posture regal, yet her eyes betrayed the tension coiling within. A faint, floral scent clung to her, the delicate fragrance of violet mingling with the faint hint of smoke from the fireplace. Poirot noted this with the same care he might observe a misplaced cufflink or an out-of-place piece of furniture. "Madame," he began, his tone as gentle as the rustle of silk, "I must ask you to recall the events of this evening. When did you last speak with your husband?" Helena's fingers tightened around the edge of her lace handkerchief, the fabric twisting under the pressure of her grip. "I last spoke with Reginald just before the performance," she replied, her voice steady but lacking warmth. "He was in his study, as usual, brooding over his papers. He seemed distracted, more so than usual." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Distracted, madame? In what manner?" A flicker of hesitation crossed her features, a brief crack in the marble facade she presented to the world. "He was angry," she admitted, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "He had received a letter earlier in the day. It arrived by special courier, a thick envelope bearing a foreign postmark. I did not see the contents, but I I could sense it disturbed him deeply. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Did he mention the nature of this letter? Helena shook her head, a small, controlled movement that revealed more than she likely intended. No, she replied quickly, too quickly. Reginald was a private man. He rarely shared his thoughts with me. Poirot allowed a brief silence to stretch between them, watching as Helena's gaze flitted momentarily toward Lucien Bellamy, who now stood by the window, his back to the room, shoulders tense. Poirot followed her line of sight, noting the connection with quiet interest before returning his attention to the young widow. Madame, Poirot continued, his tone soft yet piercing, forgive me if I am direct, but your husband's death has left many questions unanswered. You said earlier that you have nothing to hide, yet I perceive a strain between yourself and Monsieur Bellamy, a certain tension that speaks of shared secrets. Helena's head snapped back, her dark eyes narrowing, the faintest hint of color rising to her cheeks. You presume too much, Monsieur Poirot, she replied, her voice sharp now, her grip on the handkerchief tightening further. Lucien is merely a guest, an artist whom my husband admired. There is nothing more to it. Poirot's mustache twitched, his grey eyes reflecting the warm glow of the firelight as he leaned back, folding his hands neatly in his lap. Perhaps, he said mildly. But I would ask you to consider carefully what you say, madame. Secrets, once revealed, have a way of complicating even the most carefully constructed lies. Helena's face tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line, but she said nothing further. Poirot rose, his movement fluid, his gaze briefly sweeping the room as he considered his next move. Major Fitzroy, still pacing near the window, caught his eye. The man's boots made a steady, rhythmic thud against the polished floorboards, his clenched fists swinging slightly at his sides as if marching through an unseen battlefield. Poirot approached him slowly, noting the deep creases etched into the Major's sun-baked face, the rigid set of his jaw. "Major Fitzroy," Poirot said, his voice cutting cleanly through the muffled whisper of conversation. "A word, if you please." Fitzroy halted, his steel-grey eyes locking onto Poirot's with a flash of irritation. "Yes, what is it?" he barked, his tone gruff, tinged with the remnants of military command. Poirot smiled, unperturbed by the man's sharpness. "You were a close friend of Sir Reginald, were you not? I understand you served together in India many years ago." Fitzroy's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching as he considered the question. "Yes, that's right," he replied, his voice grating like the clatter of sabers. "Reginald and I served in the same regiment, fought side by side through more than a few scrapes." Poirot inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect. "Then perhaps you can help me understand something, Major. Sir Reginald, as you say, was a soldier, a man of action, of discipline. Yet tonight, in his own home, among his own guests, he met a sudden, violent end. Does that not strike you as strange?" Fitzroy's lips tightened, a muscle in, his jaw twitching. "Of course it does," he snapped, his voice rising slightly. "But if you're suggesting that someone here, one of his friends, had a hand in it, then you're barking up the wrong tree, Poirot." Poirot's eyes gleamed, his posture relaxed, but his mind sharp, probing for weaknesses in the Major's defiance. "I suggest nothing, Major. I merely observe. For example, I observe that you have been pacing the length of this room for the past quarter of an hour, your hands clenched, your face set like a man expecting an ambush. That is not the demeanor of a mere guest taken by surprise. You are angry, Major, angry and perhaps afraid." Fitzroy's fists tightened further, his knuckles whitening against the strain. For a moment, it seemed as if he might lash out, his frame trembling with barely contained fury, but then, with a sharp exhale, he turned abruptly, his boots striking the floor with a harsh, decisive crack as he stalked toward the door. "I've had enough of this nonsense," he growled over his shoulder. "If you need me, Poirot, I'll be in the library, where a man can still find a decent drink." Poirot watched him go, his sharp gaze following the stiff line of the Major's retreating figure. The tension in the room had deepened, the air growing thicker with unspoken fears and hidden resentments. Poirot felt the threads of his mental tapestry tightening, the first whispers of a pattern emerging amid the confusion. As the heavy oak door swung shut behind the Major, Poirot allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. The pieces were moving, the players revealing themselves with each carefully chosen word, each nervous glance. The truth, though still shrouded in shadows, was beginning to take shape. Poirot watched the heavy library door close behind Major Fitzroy, the sharp crack of wood against frame echoing through the room. For a moment, the silence felt oppressive, the kind that settles after a cannon blast, when the air is still thick with the lingering taste of smoke and fear. Poirot took a slow, deliberate breath, his mind turning over the Major's sharp retreat, noting the tightness of his jaw, the harshness of his footsteps. Fitzroy had the air of a man trying desperately to escape a battlefield of words he could not control. Poirot's gaze swept the remaining guests. Lady Helena remained by the fireplace, her head bowed, the lace handkerchief crumpled in her lap. Lucien Bellamy had resumed his position by the window, his long, slender fingers drumming a nervous staccato against the glass, his face partially hidden by the heavy velvet curtain. Daphne Merriweather sat perched on the edge of the settee, her wide, frightened eyes darting between Poirot and the closed library door, as if fearing the Major's sudden return. Poirot allowed the tension to hang for a moment longer before turning his attention to the young governess. He moved toward her, his steps slow and measured, his small frame casting a precise shadow against the polished parquet floor. He stopped a few paces away, folding his hands neatly before him, his gaze gentle yet probing. "Mademoiselle Merriweather," he said softly, his tone calculated to soothe rather than alarm. "May I trouble you for a word?" Daphne flinched slightly at the sound of her name, her thin shoulders drawing inward as if she wished to disappear into the cushions. She looked up at Poirot, her eyes wide and glistening, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot," she stammered, her voice trembling, the handkerchief in her lap twisted into a tight, wrinkled coil. Poirot lowered himself into the chair opposite her, leaning forward just enough to convey the intimacy of the moment without crowding her fragile composure. "You were the first to discover Sir Reginald's body," he began, his voice as soft as the rustle of silk. "You told me earlier that you entered the study to fetch a book for Lady Helena, yes?" Daphne nodded quickly, her curls bouncing with the motion, though her eyes remained fixed on the carpet. "Yes, that's right. Lady Helena asked me to retrieve a volume of poetry. A Keats, I believe. She often reads to the children before bed." Poirot's brow lifted, the faintest hint of surprise flickering across his features. "Ah, a charming tradition, to be sure. But tell me, mademoiselle, did you notice anything unusual when you entered the study? A sound, a movement, perhaps something out of place?" Daphne's fingers tightened around the handkerchief, her pale knuckles gleaming in the firelight. I do not know, Monsieur Poirot. It all happened so quickly. I opened the door and there he was on the floor, his eyes staring. I screamed, and then Dr. Beaulieu came running." Poirot leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the girl's strained expression. "And yet," he murmured, his tone soft yet unyielding, "you said earlier that you did not touch anything, that you merely stood in the doorway, too frightened to move. Is that correct?" Daphne hesitated, a faint tremor passing through her frame. Her gaze flicked briefly to Lady Helena, then back to the floor. "Yes, that's right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I did not touch a thing." Poirot's eyes sharpened, his mind turning over this small, troubling inconsistency. A faint crease appeared between his brows as he considered the implications. It was a small lie, perhaps born of fear or confusion, yet even the smallest falsehood could unravel the tightest knot of deception. "Merci, mademoiselle," he said finally, his voice once again gentle. "You have been most helpful." He rose, turning his attention to Lucien Bellamy, who still lingered by the window, his face partially obscured by the heavy curtain. Poirot approached slowly, his steps as light and precise as a dancer's, his gaze never leaving the young pianist's tense frame. "Monsieur Bellamy," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the muffled whispers of the others, "I find myself with another small question, if you would indulge me." Bellamy stiffened, his hand falling from the curtain as he turned to face Poirot, his dark eyes flashing with a mixture of defiance and unease. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot," he replied, his voice cool, though a faint tremor betrayed his nerves. Poirot paused, his head tilting slightly, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You have the hands of an artist, monsieur," he said softly, his gaze dropping to the long, slender fingers still trembling at Bellamy's sides. "Tell me, when you performed tonight, did you notice anything unusual among the guests? A whisper, a glance, a gesture perhaps that struck you as significant?" Bellamy's jaw tightened, his fingers clenching into fists as he met Poirot's steady gaze. For a moment he said nothing, the silence stretching between them like the taut strings of a grand piano, quivering on the edge of a note. I did not notice anything," he replied finally, his voice tight, his eyes shifting briefly toward Lady Helena before returning to Poirot. "I was focused on the music." Poirot's smile widened ever so slightly, his eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. "Ah, but a musician's focus is never so narrow, n'est-ce pas? You feel the pulse of the room, the unspoken rhythm of the audience. You must have sensed something, even if you did not fully understand it." Bellamy's face grew paler, his eyes widening slightly as he realized the trap into which he had stumbled. His lips parted, the faintest hint of a protest forming, but Poirot raised a hand, his expression soft yet implacable. "Non, monsieur," Poirot said gently, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Do not protest. I see it in your eyes, in the trembling of your hands. You know more than you say, and in time I will uncover it." With that, Poirot turned away, his small, polished shoes clicking softly against the polished floor as he moved back toward the center of the room, his mind already turning over the threads of the unfolding mystery. He had stirred the waters, watched the ripples spread, and now the first faint outlines of the truth were beginning to rise to the surface. Poirot paused in the center of the drawing room, his small, polished shoes perfectly aligned, as if each step had been calculated to fall precisely within the bounds of his careful, ordered mind. His gray eyes moved slowly from one face to the next, reading the subtle shifts in posture, the nervous twitches, the stolen glances that betrayed far more than mere words ever could. He had sown the first seeds of doubt, watched them sprout in the tense silence that now filled the room, and felt the threads of his net tightening around his suspects. Lady Helena remained by the fire, her face turned slightly away, the flickering light casting sharp, angular shadows across her pale features. Daphne Merriweather had shrunk back into the settee, her wide eyes darting between Poirot and the door, as if calculating the distance to a potential escape. Lucien Bellamy had resumed his place by the window, his slender fingers tapping a rapid, nervous rhythm against the glass, a musician's subconscious attempt to drown out the rising tension. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch for a moment longer, his mind turning over the fragments of conversation, the stray hints of motive that had already begun to emerge. He had not missed the way Bellamy's gaze had lingered on Lady Helena, nor the faint blush that had touched her cheeks when he had pressed her about her husband's final hours. The connection between them, though still obscured, pulsed just beneath the surface, like the slow, steady beat of a buried heart. At last, Poirot turned to Dr. Beaulieu, who had remained a silent observer throughout the unfolding drama, his sharp, analytical gaze following Poirot's every movement with the detached curiosity of a physician dissecting a particularly puzzling case. "Doctor," Poirot said, his voice cutting cleanly through the thick silence, "you were the first to reach Sir Reginald's side, were you not?" Beaulieu inclined his head slightly, his thin, ascetic features reflecting a hint of wariness. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot. I heard the scream and rushed to the study. I found Sir Reginald collapsed on the floor, his face contorted." It was clear at a glance that he was beyond help. Poirot stepped closer, his head tilting slightly as he studied the doctor's lined, weathered face. "And yet," he murmured, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "you made no effort to resuscitate him. Why, doctor?" Beaulieu's sharp grey eyes narrowed, his thin lips pressing into a tight line. "Because, Monsieur Poirot, I am a physician of some experience. I know the difference between life and death, even at a glance. Sir Reginald's body was already growing cool, his pupils fixed, his breathing ceased. There was no point in attempting to revive him." Poirot's head tilted further, his gaze never leaving the doctor's eyes. "Indeed," he replied softly. "And yet you chose to announce his death to the assembled guests with a degree of finality that struck me as premature. You did not even feign a pulse check, did not call for assistance, merely pronounced him dead and left him where he fell. I find that curious." Beaulieu's thin nostrils flared, his jaw tightening as he met Poirot's steady, unblinking gaze. "What are you implying, Monsieur Poirot?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly, the first crack in his carefully composed facade. Poirot allowed a small, enigmatic smile to touch his lips. "I imply nothing, doctor. I merely observe. You are a man of science, a man who relies on evidence and observation, and yet tonight you acted on instinct, on assumption. I find that intriguing." For a moment, the doctor said nothing, his thin frame rigid, his fingers clenching and unclenching at his sides. Then, with a sharp exhale, he turned on his heel and moved toward the sideboard, pouring himself a stiff measure of brandy. His hand trembled slightly as he raised the glass to his lips, a detail that did not escape Poirot's keen gaze. Poirot turned away, his eyes once again sweeping the room, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the quick, nervous glances exchanged between the remaining guests. The tension had deepened, the air growing thicker with each carefully chosen word, each calculated probe. He felt the first faint outlines of the truth taking shape, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with a satisfying precision. It was then that the library door swung open with a sharp, echoing creak, and Major Fitzroy reappeared, his broad frame filling the doorway, his face flushed, his jaw set in a tight, angry line. He stalked back into the room, his boots striking the floor with a harsh, deliberate rhythm, his eyes locking onto Poirot with a look of barely contained fury. "You've been busy, Poirot," he growled, his voice low and dangerous, like the rumble of distant artillery. "Stirring up trouble, poking at old wounds. I warned you once, and I'll warn you again. Tread carefully." Poirot regarded the Major with a calm, unblinking gaze, his head tilting slightly as he absorbed the man's bluster. "Major Fitzroy," he replied softly, his voice as smooth as silk. I do not tread carelessly. I merely seek the truth, however deeply it may be buried. If that truth should prove uncomfortable, it is not I who am to blame, but those who have sought to conceal it." Fitzroy's fists tightened, his broad chest rising and falling with rapid, angry breaths. For a moment, it seemed as if he might close the distance between them, his powerful frame trembling with the urge to strike. But then, with a sharp, frustrated exhale, he turned sharply on his heel and moved to the window, his back to the room, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Poirot watched him for a moment longer, his mind turning over the implications of the Major's outburst, the carefully controlled violence that simmered just beneath the surface of the man's rigid posture. The pieces were moving, the threads tightening, the truth drawing ever closer to the light. Poirot allowed himself a small, satisfied nod, his mind already turning to the next step in his carefully constructed plan. He had stirred the waters, set the players in motion, and now, as the tension reached its peak, he would watch carefully, waiting for the first crack to appear in the carefully constructed facade of lies and half-truth that surrounded him. Poirot remained perfectly still, his small, immaculately polished shoes planted firmly on the thick Aubusson rug, his sharp grey eyes never leaving the tense, broad-shouldered figure of Major Fitzroy by the window. The Major's back was rigid, his head slightly bowed, the muscles of his neck standing out like taut cables beneath his weathered skin. Poirot noted the rapid rise and fall of his shoulders, the faint tremor in his clenched fists, the way his thick, sun-browned fingers flexed and tightened against the windowsill. A soldier, yes, but a man on the edge of breaking, a man torn between duty and dread. Poirot allowed the silence to linger a moment longer, letting the tension coil and tighten, each passing second a carefully wound spring that threatened to snap at the slightest provocation. He watched as the others shifted uneasily in their seats, their eyes darting between Fitzroy and the small, motionless figure at the center of the room. Lady Helena's fingers had twisted her lace handkerchief into a tight, wrinkled knot, her knuckles white against the delicate fabric. Lucien Bellamy had resumed his nervous tapping, his long, slender fingers drumming a frantic, uneven rhythm against the glass. Daphne Merriweather had shrunk deeper into the settee, her wide, frightened eyes fixed on the broad, trembling back of the man by the window. At last, Poirot spoke, his voice cutting through the thick silence like a razor, sharp and precise, each word carefully measured, each syllable a deliberate, calculated step toward the truth. "Major Fitzroy," he said softly, his tone as gentle as the rustle of silk, yet with an unmistakable edge that cut through the tension like the first crack of a breaking dam. "You served with Sir Reginald in India, did you not? You shared the heat of the battlefield, the camaraderie of the mess hall, the long, silent nights beneath the swaying palms. You must have known him well, known his fears, his ambitions, his secrets." Fitzroy's head snapped up, his broad shoulders stiffening, his hands clenching tighter against the windowsill. For a moment he said nothing, the muscles of his jaw working silently, the cords of his neck standing out like iron bands beneath his weathered skin. Then, with a sharp, explosive exhale, he turned, his steel-gray eyes locking onto Poirot's with a fierce, burning intensity, his thick, sun-browned face flushed with barely contained fury. "What are you driving at, Poirot?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl, each word clipped and sharp, the tone of a man used to command, a man unaccustomed to being questioned. "What are you trying to say?" Poirot allowed a small, enigmatic smile to touch his lips, his sharp grey eyes never leaving the Major's furious, flushed face. "I merely observe, mon ami," he replied softly, his voice as smooth as polished marble, each word a carefully placed stone in the slowly rising edifice of his case. "I observe that you, a man of action, a man of war, a man who has faced death on countless battlefields, now tremble before the silent corpse of an old comrade. I observe that your hands shake, that your breath comes in sharp, ragged bursts, that your eyes burn with a fear that you cannot conceal, no matter how tightly you clench your fists or bite back your words. And I ask myself, why? What is it, Major, that has so unsettled the iron discipline of a soldier, that has so shaken the heart of a man who has stood unflinching before the guns of the enemy?" Fitzroy's face darkened, his broad chest heaving with rapid, angry breaths, his fists tightening at his sides until the knuckles gleamed white against the sun-browned flesh. For a moment, it seemed as if he might strike Poirot, his powerful frame trembling with the effort of restraint, his steel-grey eyes flashing with a dangerous, smouldering intensity. Then, with a sharp, sudden movement, he turned sharply on his heel and stalked toward the door, his boots striking the polished floor with a harsh, deliberate crack, each step a sharp, angry punctuation to his unspoken rage. Poirot watched him go, his sharp grey eyes narrowing slightly, his small polished shoes perfectly aligned, his mind already turning over the implications of the Major's sudden, furious retreat. He had struck a nerve, touched upon a truth that the man could not bear to face, a truth that, once revealed, would tear away the carefully constructed facade of honor and loyalty that Fitzroy had so painstakingly maintained. As the heavy oak door swung shut behind the retreating figure, Poirot allowed himself a small, satisfied nod, his mind already racing ahead, piecing together the fragments of truth that had begun to emerge, the first faint outlines of the puzzle taking shape beneath his careful, probing gaze. He turned, his sharp grey eyes sweeping the room, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the nervous, darting glances, the faint sheen of sweat that now glistened on Lucien Bellamy's pale, angular face. The young pianist had gone deathly still, his long, slender fingers frozen against the glass, his dark eyes wide and glassy, like those of a cornered animal. Lady Helena had lowered her head, her fingers still twisting the lace handkerchief in her lap, her shoulders bowed beneath the weight of some unspoken fear. Daphne Merriweather had shrunk further into the settee, her wide, frightened eyes fixed on the door through which the Major had disappeared, her small, delicate hands clenched tightly in her lap. Poirot moved slowly to the center of the room, his small, polished shoes clicking softly against the polished floor, his sharp grey eyes never leaving the pale, trembling figure of Lucien Bellamy by the window. He paused, his head tilting slightly, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he regarded the young musician's tense, frozen frame. "Monsieur Bellamy," he said softly, his voice cutting cleanly through the thick silence, each word a carefully placed stone in the slowly rising edifice of his case. "You seem troubled. Is there something you would like to share with us, perhaps? A truth that you have thus far concealed, a confession that weighs heavily upon your heart?" Bellamy's head snapped up, his dark eyes wide and glassy, his long, slender fingers tightening against the glass, the muscles of his thin, angular frame trembling with barely contained fear. For a moment, he said nothing, his lips working silently, his eyes darting wildly from Poirot to Lady Helena, then back again, as if searching for some unseen escape, some desperate, impossible means of avoiding the truth that now loomed before him like the shadow of the hangman's noose. Poirot allowed the silence to linger for a moment longer, his sharp grey eyes never leaving the young man's pale, trembling face, his mind turning over the fragments of truth that had begun to emerge, the first faint outlines of the puzzle taking shape beneath his careful, probing gaze. Bellamy's trembling fingers tightened against the glass, his dark eyes still fixed on Poirot, wide and glassy, like a trapped animal caught in the flickering light of an oncoming train. His pale, angular face had grown even whiter, the faint sheen of sweat glistening on his brow, each rapid breath a sharp, rasping whisper against the heavy silence that now filled the room. Poirot took a small, deliberate step closer, his head tilting slightly, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he studied the young man's tense, frozen frame. "Come now, Monsieur Bellamy," he said softly, his voice as smooth and polished as the surface of a grand piano, each word a carefully placed note in the slowly building symphony of his case. "You are an artist, a man of passion, a man who feels deeply, who senses the hidden currents of emotion that ripple beneath the surface of every human interaction. Surely you have sensed something, seen something, heard something that you have not yet shared with us." Bellamy's dark eyes flicked briefly toward Lady Helena, his thin, delicate throat working silently as he struggled to form words, his long, slender fingers trembling against the cool, unyielding glass. For a moment, he said nothing, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths, his thin, angular frame trembling with barely contained fear. Then, with a sharp, sudden intake of breath, he turned away from the window, his long, pale hands clenching into tight, trembling fists at his sides. I "I have nothing to say, Monsieur Poirot," he stammered, his voice tight and strained, each syllable a sharp, jagged shard of glass against the thick, oppressive silence that now filled the room. I know nothing. I saw nothing. I heard nothing. Please, I have told you all I know." Poirot's sharp grey eyes narrowed slightly, his head tilting further, the faintest hint of a frown creasing his smooth, polished brow. "Non, monsieur," he replied softly, his voice dropping to a near whisper, each word a carefully placed stone in the slowly rising edifice of his case. "That I do not believe. You are a musician, a man attuned to the subtle rhythms of the human heart, the unspoken notes of fear and desire that echo in every whispered word, every stolen glance, every trembling breath. You have felt something, sensed something, seen something that you have not yet shared with us. And now, I ask you, as a man of honor, as a man of conscience, to speak the truth." Bellamy's fists tightened further, his long, slender fingers digging into his palms, the tendons of his thin, angular wrists standing out like taut wires beneath his pale, sweat-slicked skin. His dark eyes flicked once more toward Lady Helena, his lips parting slightly, his thin, pale throat working silently as he struggled to form words. For a moment, it seemed as if he might speak, might finally break beneath the mounting pressure, the carefully orchestrated crescendo of Poirot's relentless probing. But then, with a sharp, sudden exhale, he turned sharply on his heel and stalked toward the door, his long, slender frame trembling with barely contained fear, his thin, pale hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. I cannot," he whispered, his voice a low, desperate hiss, each word a sharp, jagged shard of glass against the thick, oppressive silence that now filled the room. I cannot. I must go." Poirot watched him go, his sharp grey eyes narrowing slightly, his small, polished shoes perfectly aligned, his mind already turning over the implications of the young man's sudden, fearful retreat. He had touched a nerve, struck a deep, hidden chord that resonated with the faint, trembling echoes of a long-buried truth. A truth that, once uncovered, would tear away the carefully constructed facade of innocence and deception that Bellamy had so painstakingly maintained. As the heavy oak door swung shut behind the retreating figure, Poirot allowed himself a small, satisfied nod, his mind already racing ahead, piecing together the fragments of truth that had begun to emerge, the first faint outlines of the puzzle taking shape beneath his careful, probing gaze. He turned, his sharp grey eyes sweeping the room, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the nervous, darting glances, the faint sheen of sweat that now glistened on Lady Helena's pale, angular face. She had gone deathly still, her long, slender fingers twisting the lace handkerchief in her lap, her wide, frightened eyes fixed on the door through which Bellamy had disappeared, her thin, delicate frame trembling with barely contained fear. Poirot moved slowly toward her, his small, polished shoes clicking softly against the polished floor, his sharp, grey eyes never leaving her pale, trembling face. He paused, his head tilting slightly, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he regarded the young woman's tense, frozen frame. "Lady Helena," he said softly, his voice cutting, cleanly through the thick silence, each word a carefully placed note in the slowly building symphony of his case. "You too seem troubled. Is there something you would like to share with us, perhaps? A truth that you have thus far concealed, a confession that weighs heavily upon your heart?" Lady Helena's head snapped up, her wide, frightened eyes locking onto Poirot's sharp, grey gaze, her long, slender fingers tightening around the twisted lace handkerchief in her lap. For a moment, she said nothing, her thin, delicate frame trembling with barely contained fear, her wide, frightened eyes darting between Poirot and the door through which Bellamy had disappeared. Poirot allowed the silence to linger for a moment longer, his sharp grey eyes never leaving the young woman's pale, trembling face, his mind turning over the fragments of truth that had begun to emerge, the first faint outlines of the puzzle taking shape beneath his careful, probing gaze. Finally, with a sharp, sudden intake of breath, Lady Helena's shoulders sagged, her head bowing slightly, the twisted lace handkerchief falling from her trembling fingers to the polished floor at her feet. She exhaled sharply, a thin, trembling sound that seemed to echo through the thick, oppressive silence, each rapid, shallow breath a sharp, jagged shard of glass against the thick, oppressive silence that now filled the room. Poirot leaned in slightly, his sharp grey eyes narrowing as he watched the young woman's thin, trembling frame, his mind already turning over the implications of her sudden, fearful surrender, the carefully constructed facade of innocence and deception that had begun to crumble beneath the relentless pressure of his probing gaze. Lady Helena's voice trembled as it escaped her lips, quiet and fractured like the first delicate notes of a nocturne played with unsteady hands. "It was never meant to happen," she whispered. "Not like this. I only wanted to protect someone, to shield a life from scandal. But now—" Her voice cracked, and she pressed her hands to her mouth as if trying to contain a wave of emotion threatening to burst forth. Poirot, ever gentle yet unyielding, leaned forward slightly, his hands folded neatly upon his knees, his expression calm, almost compassionate. "You are speaking in shadows, madame. But the truth, it does not exist in twilight. If you wish to protect anyone now, it must be with clarity. The truth, you see, it is like a musical phrase. If incomplete, it loses all meaning." She gave a single, jerking nod, then closed her eyes for a moment as though summoning the strength to continue. "There was something between Ainsley and Marcus Bellamy," she said at last. "Not a romance, not exactly, but there was an understanding, a shared past that neither of them ever spoke of directly. I only became aware of it after I saw a letter Ainsley received, handwritten, short. I only glimpsed it before she burned it, but I saw the name Bellamy." Poirot nodded slowly. "You believe she was being threatened?" "I don't know," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Perhaps. But I do know she was frightened. I've known Ainsley since we were schoolgirls. She was bold, impetuous, rarely rattled. But the last few weeks, she'd been distant, secretive. And then the music. The music." Poirot's eyes glinted with interest. Lady Helena hesitated. "Yes, at the conservatory. She had been working on an original composition, an uncharacteristically dark piece. She said it came to her suddenly, as if it were being dictated to her by a ghost. She called it The Farewell. She played it for me just once. It was haunting, dissonant. And now I wonder—" Her voice faltered, but Poirot gently filled the silence. "You wonder whether the piece was more than music. A cipher, perhaps. A confession or a warning." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I dismissed it at the time, thought it was Ainsley being theatrical. But after her death, I began to fear that there was something hidden within it, something she couldn't say aloud." Poirot stood slowly, placing a reassuring hand on Lady Helena's shoulder. "Thank you, madam. You have been most helpful. Now, if you will excuse me, there is someone I must see." Outside, the evening had deepened. The street lamps flickered to life, casting a golden hue over the narrow streets of Kensington. Poirot hailed a cab and gave the driver an address, the London Conservatory of Music. The building loomed quiet and dignified in the dusk. Poirot was admitted by a sleepy janitor who recognized him at once and led him through the high-ceilinged corridors to the practice wing. The room Ainsley had used, room 14, had remained locked since her death. Poirot requested the key. Inside, the air smelled faintly of rosin and old wood. A grand piano stood at the center, its lid closed, a scattering of sheet music resting atop it. Poirot moved slowly, almost reverently, around the room, his eyes scanning the space with quiet intensity. He lifted the lid of the piano and ran his fingers along the keys, not playing, but sensing. Then he examined the music. The composition titled The Farewell was there, handwritten with an uneven scrawl in the margins. A few notes had been heavily circled in red ink. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Curious," he murmured. He stepped back, tilting his head, examining the notations. With sudden precision, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small notebook. A cipher indeed, he thought. Not just any cipher. This was a musical cryptograph where specific notes corresponded to letters, common among composers with secrets to hide. With painstaking care, he transcribed the circled notes into letters. His brow furrowed. The message was incomplete, perhaps intentional, but even fragmented, it was chilling. He knows. Danger. B. Poirot tapped the pencil against his chin. B. Bellamy? Or perhaps Baines? No, too obvious. It might well be a red herring, or worse, a cry for help misread by all until now. He turned toward the corner of the room and noticed something curious, a cigarette case, silver, slender, and distinctly out of place in the otherwise orderly room. Poirot picked it up delicately. Inside were 2 cigarettes, Russian in origin, with a faintly sweet scent. Not Ainsley's taste, but then he saw it. The faintest monogram engraved on the inner lid. J.B. "Ah," he whispered. "Monsieur Bellamy, your fingerprints are all over this crime, if not literally, then psychologically." Poirot pocketed the case and returned to the cab, now giving a different address. Bellamy's flat in Marylebone. It was time, he felt, to draw the net tighter. Bellamy answered the door himself, pale and drawn, his collar open, his cuffs unbuttoned. The interior of his flat was disordered, music scattered across the floor, an empty bottle of absinthe lying on its side. "You've come to accuse me," he said flatly, not a question but a weary statement. "No, monsieur," Poirot said gently. "I've come to understand, and to give you the opportunity to tell me the truth before I tell it to others." Bellamy sagged against the doorframe. "She was everything," he said, almost inaudibly. "Brilliant, proud, cruel too in her way, but I loved her. Once." Poirot said nothing, only waited, the silence pressing. "She destroyed me," Bellamy went on. "We had a history. Years ago in Paris, she lifted me up, then abandoned me, mocked me in front of others, said I would never be a real composer. It ruined me. I wandered for years, playing in smoke-filled cafes for coins, and then I returned. I saw she had become untouchable, respected, and I—" "You wished to humble her?" Poirot offered softly. "No," Bellamy snapped. "Not humble. I wished for her to hear my music, just once, to see that I had become more than she ever imagined. But when I approached her, she laughed, told me I was still nothing." His voice broke and he turned away. "But I didn't kill her. I swear it, I wanted her to hear my piece. And she did. That night, just before—" He trailed off. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Your piece? Not hers?" Bellamy turned, his face bleak. She copied it, note for note, passed it off as her own. That was the final betrayal. Poirot nodded slowly, then turned to the door. "You have said enough. For now." As he left the flat and stepped into the cool night air, Poirot's mind raced. Bellamy had motive, passion, and opportunity. But he lacked something crucial. Control. His emotions betrayed him. And Ainsley had sensed her death. Someone she feared deeply, more than a scorned composer. Poirot returned to his flat and opened his notebook. The letters from the cipher glared at him. He knows. Danger. B. Not Bellamy, but someone whose name she couldn't finish. A knock sounded at his door. Poirot opened it to find Inspector Cray, breathless. "Poirot." There's been a break-in at the publisher's office. Ainsley's contract files were taken. Nothing else. Poirot's eyes flashed. Ah, the publisher indeed. It is time, mon ami, to gather all our players. The final act is upon us. The drawing room of Lady Helena's townhouse had been transformed into a theatre of tension. The guests, no, the suspects, had been assembled under Poirot's precise instructions. They sat scattered across the brocaded furniture, shifting in their seats, murmuring in clipped tones, eyes darting toward the door as if it might provide escape. Lady Helena perched with quiet dignity on a chaise near the fireplace, her expression unreadable. Marcus Bellamy brooded in a corner armchair, his shoulders hunched, his fingers twitching. Julian Baines, the handsome and calculating music publisher, stood by the window, hands behind his back, jaw tense. Camilla Hawthorne, Ainsley's sharp-tongued cousin, drummed her nails along the arm of a velvet chair, her mouth pressed into a thin, impatient line. Even Inspector Cray stood off to one side, arms crossed, watching Poirot as if awaiting a conjuring trick. Poirot entered with deliberate poise, his shoes tapping softly on the polished floor. He made no dramatic gestures, no grand pronouncements, only settled himself into a chair placed conspicuously in the center of the room. He folded his hands in his lap and regarded the assembled company with serene confidence. "Mes amis," he began, "the truth is a thing like a melody. At times it disguises itself in harmony, in the swelling of other instruments, but eventually it must resolve. Today we arrive at the final chord." A hush fell. Even Camilla ceased her rhythmic tapping. When I first learned of Mademoiselle Ainsley Rutherford's death, I asked myself only one question. Pourquoi? Not how, not who, but why. For when one understands the motive, the rest begins to unravel. Poirot glanced at Julian Baines. "Let us begin with you, monsieur. The publisher. It was you who introduced Ainsley to the world, elevated her to a fame she had not yet earned. But fame, as you know well, is a double-edged blade." Julian's jaw tightened. "Are you accusing me of something, Poirot?" "Not yet," Poirot said mildly. "You see, I have discovered that Ainsley had recently written a new piece, a composition unlike any of her previous works, one that she refused to publish under her contract with you. That, I believe, created conflict, personal, financial, and possibly legal." Baines exhaled through his nose. "She had the right to decline a piece for publication." "No, monsieur. She had the desire to withhold it, but the right, that depends on the contract." Poirot held up a single sheet of paper, neatly folded. "After the break-in at your office. An act, I might add, that was staged, to appear random. I obtained the surviving copy of her contract through another channel. It contains a clause. All musical works created during the term of the contract are the property of the publisher. You stood to lose much if she chose to challenge it." Baines's composure cracked for a second. "She said she'd write under a pseudonym, that the music wasn't hers to sell." "Nonsense," I told her. "Indeed," said Poirot softly, "because the piece was not hers, it was his." He turned his gaze to Bellamy. Bellamy shifted. "I told you," I confronted her. "She refused to acknowledge it was mine. That was the end of it." "No, monsieur, it was the beginning." Poirot's voice remained calm, but the intensity behind it sharpened. "You see, Ainsley composed the farewell using a musical cipher. Hidden within it was a message, 'He knows, danger, be—'" This was not a warning to her, but a message from her. She knew someone was after her. She feared for her life. Bellamy's face paled. "It wasn't me, I swear. I gave her the composition freely, years ago. We argued, yes, but I never—" "I believe you," Poirot said simply. A visible ripple passed through the room. "You loved her once, and even in bitterness, your resentment lacked the careful restraint that murder requires. You're a man of passion, not calculation. But this crime, it was deliberate. It was designed to look accidental, even poetic. He rose from his chair and walked slowly to the fireplace, where he lifted a photograph from the mantel. Ainsley seated at the piano, smiling, a shadow just behind her shoulder. "Camilla," Poirot said, not turning around. "You stood to inherit nothing. You were jealous, yes, but petty jealousy rarely leads to murder. And Lady Helena, your friendship was sincere, your grief unfeigned. Which brings us to the one person in this room who had both motive and means, and, crucially, a history of quiet manipulation." He turned sharply to Julian Baines. "You knew of the cipher. You published enough of Ainsley's work to recognize her notational habits. You knew that the farewell was not hers. But you also knew that if it came to light, it would ruin both her legacy and your control over her catalogue. And so, when she refused to publish it and spoke of taking legal action, you acted." Baines stared at him. "I had no reason to kill her. If anything, I would have profited more from her living." Poirot raised a finger. "No, you would have profited more if she remained silent and cooperative. But she was neither. And so you arranged for her death to look like an unfortunate accident, gas inhalation from a faulty valve. But there was no faulty valve. I inspected the conservatory. The leak was caused by deliberate tampering of the piping hidden behind a storage cabinet, a panel disturbed only recently." He took a step closer, and when Ainsley sensed she was in danger, she hit her final clue in the only language she trusted: music. A language she believed only one person would understand: Bellamy. A long silence followed. Then Julian laughed, softly at first, then bitterly. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," he murmured. "She was brilliant, but reckless. She thought she could cheat me. She thought she could make demands. And then that washed-up hack came back into her life, and suddenly I was the villain. I built her. I made her name what it was." "And you ended it," Poirot said coldly. "Not out of rage, but out of vanity. You saw yourself as the genius behind the throne, and when your creation rebelled, you silenced her." Julian took a step back, his face paling. "This is absurd. You have no proof." "On the contrary," said Poirot. "You left behind more than you knew. The silver cigarette case, monogrammed. Found in her practice room. Russian cigarettes, your preference according to the staff at your office. And now, a break-in to cover your tracks. You should not have gone yourself, monsieur. You left muddy footprints, size 9, imported Italian soles. The same pair you wore to the reception the day before." At last, Baines broke. He lunged toward the door, but Cray intercepted him with quiet efficiency, snapping handcuffs around his wrists. As the inspector led him away, Baines's last words echoed. "She wasn't supposed to fight back." The room was still. Poirot adjusted his cuffs and sat once more. Lady Helena's voice came, quiet and trembling. "What happens now, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot gave a small, sad smile. "Now, madame, the music can be heard for what it truly is. A farewell, yes, but also a warning. And justice." She plays the final note. He rose and turned toward the window, the first rays of morning light breaking through the clouds. Behind him, silence returned to the room, an epilogue of sighs and breath held too long. Poirot, with infinite care, adjusted his boutonniere and gave a final glance toward the piano. "Finis," he whispered.